Thanks for being with us here on Morning Live. Now, the presidency says it is concerned about the newly imposed tariffs on South African exports to the United States. And this follows the United States President Donald Trump announcing global reciprocal tariffs on some of his country's key trade partners, including the European Union, China, India, Israel, and, of course, South Africa. Now, Trump described the countries as some of the worst offenders and said that this was payback for unfair trade policies. Now, to help us unpack what these changes actually mean for South Africans and how the global economies will be impacted, we're joined virtually now by Meluleki Nzimande, who is Webber Wentzel partner in competition, trade and investment. Mr. Nzimande, thanks for your time. Welcome to Morning Live.
Good morning, Sakina, and thank you for the invitation.
So let's just look first off at how the markets fared following that announcement by Donald Trump. We knew the announcement was coming, but of course, how much of that could the markets factor in to actually help cushion the blow?
Well, Sakina, it is Liberation Day, according to Trump, and indeed the markets reacted accordingly. A lot of them went down both in the US and in South Africa. The fact that the announcement was anticipated doesn't really mitigate the risk, at least in the short term, that the markets are seeing to the economies both globally and nationally across the world.
Now, South Africa, we're facing a 30% tariff on some of our goods. What does this mean for South Africans buying U.S. products and also for exports to the United States? Because it's not on all of our products. So for the lay person, please explain to us how this is going to impact us.
Well, Sakina, we need to look at it from two perspectives. The first perspective is for outbound goods from South Africa to the US. The 30% that you referred to is being imposed over and above all other duties that are currently in place. And as you would be aware, the autos were already levied with a 25% tariff even before these liberation tariffs were imposed. What does that mean? It means that goods which we export to the US are now subject to that additional 30%. And that's a hefty margin. If it's a smaller margin, say 5, 10%, 15% margin, the importers and the exporters can work out a mechanism to mitigate the impact of that duty, even though it is high, maybe split it 7.5%, 7.5%, so that the consumer in the US is not impacted. But 30% is very high for a South African exporter and a US importer to try and absorb. And what that means is that then the volume of goods that we are going to be exporting into the US market is likely or may decrease. And with that, unless we're able to sell those goods elsewhere in the world, it means production in South Africa, the goods that we make, is going to have to be scaled back, resulting in possible losses of revenue, which then might mean losses of jobs. It might mean losses of taxes that are paid to the state, which is generally adverse for the economy. So having said that, my caution is sit down in your sector, analyze your sector, and make informed decisions about how best to mitigate these developments, these tariffs.
So looking at the impact of these reciprocal tariffs, it doesn't only affect South Africa, it affects everyone across the world who trades with the United States. Does this mean that everyone who has now been slapped with these tariffs would start looking at each other perhaps to trade more, or does it simply mean that most of these countries will then go and try and negotiate with the United States bilaterally perhaps or regionally for better tariffs?
Yes. In fact, both are possible solutions. Bilateral negotiations are useful and meaningful where the bargaining power is more or less symmetrical. Where there's an asymmetry, take a country like Lesotho, for instance. If it were to enter into negotiations with the US, the power dynamics, Lesotho is one of the least developed economies in the world. The power dynamics are such that it will basically have to do what the US tells it to do. So bilateral negotiations can be pursued, but have regard to the power dynamics at play in that context. Bloc negotiations are better if the Southern African Customs Union, which comprises South Africa, Lesotho, Botswana, Namibia, and Eswatini, go together. It does, to some degree, mitigate the power dynamics. But if we go together as the African continent or as the Southern African bloc, it balances a bit the power dynamics. If the EU, for instance, negotiates with the US, the power dynamics are more or less balanced. China, US power dynamics are more or less balanced. So yes, that is one avenue. The other avenue is the one that you mentioned, where countries' regional trade start taking off to mitigate the adverse impact of a closed US market. Also, alliances such as BRICS, alliances such as other blocks that will emerge as a result of these developments would also serve to mitigate the impact. What I should say, however, Sakina, is that the rationale behind Trump's actions, and I know I'm venturing into dangerous territory trying to understand President Trump, but my sense is that he is trying to solve an economic problem inside the US, and the rest of the world are really, victims of what he's trying to do in the US.
And to that point, Mr. Nzimande, people are questioning what is actually going on. They're questioning, how the percentages have been calculated, how he got to some of these numbers. But they're also wondering, if you look at South Africa being slapped with that 60% tariff on US goods, 30%, and asking whether that 30% is actually factual. What is it based on? Because it seems nobody is safe, because the president of the US also went and slapped tariffs on uninhabited islands, Heard Island, McDonald Island. Nobody there. Some of these places only have seals and penguins, but they were also, on the list of territories where there would be tariffs.
Look, I do not purport to have the wisdom, to explain exactly how these duties were calculated. A general observation, however, is that there has been a calculation of the average applied tariff when goods are imported from the US into a particular country, such as South Africa, for instance. The calculation that the US has made is that on average, the applied tariff against US goods into South Africa is 60%. And when they then worked out the reciprocal duty that the US would impose against South African goods, they imposed 50% of that. So that's how you get to the 30%. And likewise, if you take a country like Lesotho, the average applied duty of imports into Lesotho from the US, it was calculated to be 99%, and the reciprocal duty that the US has imposed against Lesotho is 50%. So it looks to be that way. But as to how the starting base was determined is hard to say. But it seems to me is the average applied duty, and at the risk of being wrong here, I suspect that it was an algorithm that was used to do these calculations, and it got some of the information wrong.
Which brings us then to AGOA, because if you look at a country like Lesotho, and I think they were slapped 50%, if I'm not mistaken, and countries who are part of AGOA then would then naturally, on average, have higher trade with the US, which means we would be taxed more, as shown by these tariffs that were released. Or am I misunderstanding that?
I would call it a misunderstanding, but an understandable misunderstanding. That's the logic that you would expect, Sakina, what you have just explained. But let me just give you one interesting statistic. Total trade that Africa accounts for in respect of what the US trades with the rest of the world is 1%. So how and AGOA is intended to benefit 32 African states, not even all 54, 32 African states. So if you look at that, the impact that we have really now as South Africa, a country, on the US economy is minuscule because we are a portion of that 1%. So your statement, in your logic, you'd expect that the US is looking at countries that have got significant trade with the US, such as, for instance, China, at territories such as the EU. Canada has got significant trade with the US, Mexico. But these reciprocal tariffs don't seem to follow that logic. I go back to what I said earlier. If you are looking at a holistic resolution to the economic problem that the US faces, then perhaps you'll begin to understand. One of the things that has happened post-Cold War is that with the open, globalized economy, is that the industrial base of the US has shrunk and the industrial base of countries such as China has shot up. As a result, blue-collar jobs in the US have been lost and blue-collar jobs in China have increased. And now I'm not whipping China as such, but I'm just saying that the share of manufacturing as a percentage of GDP has really adversely affected the US economy by decreasing and by extension affected the way of life of Americans. And what I suspect Trump is trying to do is to claw back some of those losses and bring back manufacturing to the US. And whether that will work is another question.
Indeed, and of course, we sit with a similar situation to the one you just described in terms of manufacturing sector here in South Africa. But the presidency has said, Mr. Nzimande, that while South Africa remains committed to a mutually beneficial trade relationship with the United States, this imposition of unilateral punitive tariffs is a concern, and that it continues to serve as a barrier to trade and shared prosperity. But how do you think South Africa should respond to this?
Well, the president is absolutely correct. In fact, in some quarters, it has been this development has been referred to as the end of globalization as we know it, and the rules-based international order organized around the World Trade Organization. And South Africa, as you know, has been a member of the World Trade Organization since inception. Ordinarily, we would rush to the World Trade Organization and seek remedy to try and roll back these tariffs. But the health of the World Trade Organization, as we speak, is really poor. The appellate body is dysfunctional. The panels are working. It's not even guaranteed whether, if ever, a remedy is sought at the WTO, and the US is ordered to roll back some of the tariffs, whether the US will comply. So it's a serious, I would call it, dislocation in the global trading system as we know it. The best approach, in my view, is for businesses, private sector in South Africa and private sector in the US, to start talking and to see how can they work together to secure supply chains, to secure services to their respective consumers. The other, of course, option is to try and strike a deal, a bilateral trade deal between South Africa and the US with the attendant risks that I've pointed out earlier. The other option, of course, is the one that we discussed also earlier, which is just trade with other less, with other economies that are still willing to trade on an open basis, or at least on what remains of the rules-based world trading system. One thing which maybe I should mention, Sakina, is that at the moment, AGOA remains in place, even though it will expire in September unless it is renewed. That still gives eligible African countries a certain advantage relative to others, because the 30% that you're talking to in relation to South Africa is imposed on top of other duties. And because of AGOA, as matters currently stand, other duties for a number of South African goods exported to the US will then still be zero because of the AGOA preference. So we will still get that sort of discount relative to others. But it's cold comfort if that 30% acts effectively as a barrier. So yes, either negotiate and see where you get. Two, business between the two countries should talk and see how to salvage the situation. Thirdly, diversify away from the US and supply other markets.
So in a minute or less, Mr. Nzimande, we are not the US's favorite place or country right now by all indications, looking at how the Trump administration has actually interacted with South Africa of late. So with AGOA, as you say, that agreement coming to an end, we don't know whether, we will be part of that arrangement going forward. How should the South African government mitigate for the worst case scenario in this instance?
Yeah, the best way again, Sakina, is firstly, in my view, is to diversify away from the US. Let me point out that our trade exposure to the US is approximately 25% of our exports. I mean, that's a rough figure. The rest of the 75% is traded to the rest of the world. About 25% is with the rest of the African continent, where we sell value-added goods, comparable or even more value-added than what we export to the US. We also trade with the EU. With the EU, we've got an economic partnership agreement, as we do with the UK. Again, the pattern and the type of goods that we trade with the with the EU and with the UK is not too dissimilar to what we trade with the US. So look at and because of the economic partnership agreement, we've got a preferential access to the EU market. So it's a natural place where we should focus to divert our trade. And then, of course, there's China and the rest of the world. So my view is diversify away from the US, engage the US to the extent that it is possible to do so, and private sector should bring its way to the table.
Mr. Nzimande, thanks so much. Webber Wentzel, partner in competition, trade and investment, talking to us about how the global trade tariffs announced by United States President Donald Trump will impact South Africans.